When the Americans come for you tonight, use this knife. Not on them. On yourself. The blade passed from woman to woman in the darkness of the ship's hold. 37 Japanese prisoners, each touching the cold steel before passing it on. A ritual of death. They had chosen the oldest among them to go first, Fumiko, a 56-year-old calligraphy teacher who once created beauty with her hands. Now, those same hands would end lives, starting with her own. The Pacific Ocean, November 1945, 3 months after Japan's surrender. Americans keep Japanese women alive for months, whispered Etsuko, clutching the knife before passing it to another trembling hand. They use them until nothing human remains. Then they display their bodies as trophies. 19-year-old Harumi pressed her sleeping 2-year-old son against her chest. When she received the blade, she kissed it. For my son first, she whispered. Then for me, no American will touch him. This wasn't propaganda. This wasn't rumor. This was what every Japanese citizen knew as absolute truth. For these women, nurses, teachers, mothers, capture meant only one honorable choice: death before American hands could reach them. The ship's metal door slammed open. Blinding light. American soldiers silhouetted against the brightness. Towering figures speaking harsh, guttural English. One woman immediately reached for her hidden blade. But what happened next would shatter everything these women believed about their enemy, about Americans, about humanity itself. What if everything you were absolutely certain about was completely, utterly wrong? These Japanese women were about to discover that the greatest weapon America possessed wasn't in its arsenal. It was in its restraint. The most shocking thing awaiting these prisoners wasn't pain. It was dignity. The women were headed for a Kansas POW camp where they would experience something so unexpected, so contrary to everything they had been told, that many couldn't process it. American soldiers who wouldn't even touch them. Not once, not ever. Guards who knocked before entering, who provided food, medicine, and warm blankets, who paid them for work. This true story from the closing moments of World War II reveals the extraordinary power of human decency in the midst of history's darkest chapter. A story about enemies becoming human again. A story that will make you question what you thought you knew about the greatest generation. If you think you've heard every World War II story worth telling, this forgotten chapter will prove you wrong in the next 10 minutes. Hit that subscribe button right now, because the untold stories of WWW reveal more about humanity than the familiar ones ever could. And this story, this incredible, true story, might just restore your faith in what people are capable of, even when the world gives them every reason to be monsters. In Japan during World War II, the government controlled everything people saw and heard. Every morning, Japanese citizens would wake up to new posters on street corners showing American soldiers with fangs dripping blood, claws instead of hands, and eyes that glowed red with hatred. Radio broadcasts described Americans as blue-eyed devils who tortured prisoners for fun. Newspapers printed stories about American soldiers who collected ears and teeth from Japanese victims. Movies showed actors playing Americans laughing while they hurt, captured Japanese women and children. The American is not human, teachers told schoolchildren. He is a beast who has forgotten what mercy means. Fumiko Tanaka had been one of those teachers. Before the war moved her to Saipan, she had taught calligraphy to wealthy children in Kyoto. She would carefully guide their hands as they formed beautiful Japanese characters. Precision matters, she would tell them. Carefulness matters. Now, at 56, her arthritic hands could still write with elegance, but these days she used them to count food rations and mend clothing. Teacher Fumiko, the younger women called her, even here on Saipan, an island far from Japan that had been Japanese territory since 1914. They came to her with questions, with problems. She was the oldest among them, the wisest, but she had no answers for what was coming. Harumi Watanabe had been only 17 when she married a civilian engineer who was sent to build defenses on Saipan. By 19, she had a son. Her husband had been killed during the American bombing of the harbor. Now, she lived with 4 other war widows in a small house near the island's main town. Americans drop candy to trick children into coming close, then they throw grenades. Harumi told her 2-year-old son every night, If you see an American, run to mama. Always run to mama. Saipan had once been beautiful. Palm trees swayed in ocean breezes. Fish were plentiful. The 37 Japanese women who would later be captured had lived simple lives there, working in administration offices, teaching at schools, nursing at the small hospital. Some, like Harumi, were mothers raising children. Others were single women doing their part for Japan's war effort. Then came June 15th, 1944, the day American ships appeared on the horizon, the day the sky filled with planes, the day the bombing began. Remember your duty to the emperor, the Japanese military officers told the civilians. Americans torture their prisoners. They conduct experiments. They keep women for their pleasure until death is a mercy. No Japanese must be taken alive. The military distributed pamphlets with detailed instructions for suicide, pills for those who had them, grenades for families to share. For those with nothing else, there were cliffs on the north side of the island. Parents should throw their children first, then jump themselves. Death before surrender became the island's mantra. For 2 weeks, as American forces pushed inland, Japanese civilians fled higher into the mountains. They hid in caves. They ran from shelter to shelter. Food became scarce. Water was precious. Children cried from hunger and fear. Fumiko organized the women in her cave. We must prepare ourselves, she told them as American artillery shook the ground. If they reach us, we must be ready. The women nodded. They understood what ready meant. Each woman found a weapon. Kitchen knives, sharpened sticks, rocks heavy enough to crush a skull if the wielder was determined enough. Not for them, Fumiko had said, looking at each woman in turn. For ourselves. For our children. Sachiko, a 25-year-old nurse, had stolen morphine from the hospital before it was bombed. Enough for 6, she whispered. Quick and painless? They made plans. Who would go first? Who would help the mothers with children? Who would be last? Harumi practiced every night after her son fell asleep. She held the knife to his throat, then to her own, measuring the angle, calculating the force needed. She never let herself cry during these rehearsals. Tears would make her hands shake. Shaking hands might mean suffering for her son. Precision mattered. Carefulness mattered. American demons eat Japanese babies, an old man had told her, his eyes wild with fear and hunger. They keep the mothers alive to watch. By the 3rd week of fighting, most of the Japanese soldiers on Saipan were dead. Those remaining prepared for a final suicidal charge against American lines. The civilians were on their own. On July 9th, 1944, American troops reached the cave where Fumiko, Harumi, and 35 other women were hiding. The women clutched their weapons, ready to fulfill their final duty to the emperor. Now, Fumiko whispered as American shadows appeared at the cave entrance. Harumi raised her knife to her son's throat, but something unexpected happened. An American soldier with a megaphone spoke in broken Japanese. We will not harm you. You will receive food and water. You will receive medical care. Please surrender peacefully. The women hesitated, confused. This had to be a trick. Everyone knew Americans killed their prisoners. Your emperor would want you to live? The voice continued. The war will end someday. You can go home. Fumiko, who had been ready to die moments before, felt doubt creep in for the first time. What if they could survive? What if they could see Japan again? Wait, she told the others, her voice shaking. Just wait. Minutes stretched into hours as American soldiers remained outside, occasionally repeating their message. They threw water bottles into the cave, then medical supplies, then food rations, no shooting. No rushing in to capture them. Night fell. The women whispered among themselves. It's a trick, some said. But why waste food on us? Others wondered. By morning, hunger and thirst had won over fear for many. Mothers couldn't bear their children's crying anymore. Sachiko, the nurse, went first. I'll test their words, she said, pocketing her morphine vials. If they harm me, you'll know what to do. She walked out with her hands up. The women inside the cave waited for screams, for gunshots, for proof that the propaganda was right. Instead, they heard nothing, just quiet conversation, then Sachiko's voice calling back. They gave me more water. They have a doctor. One by one, the women emerged, blinking in the sunlight, still clutching their hidden weapons. American soldiers stood at a distance, pointing to a medical tent, to food stations. When they were all out, they were guided to trucks. No one searched them, no one touched them. Harumi held her son tight, her knife still hidden in her clothes, still ready, still waiting for the monsters from the posters to reveal themselves. The trucks took them to the beach where American ships waited to transport prisoners to holding facilities. As they were loaded onto the ships, each woman expected this would be the moment the Americans showed their true nature. But that moment didn't come. Not that day, not the next, not during the weeks of processing before they were finally loaded onto the transport ship crossing the Pacific. And still, they didn't believe. They couldn't believe. Everything they'd ever been told said. This kindness was impossible. It had to be a trick. The real America, the America of their nightmares, surely waited for them across the ocean. For 12 days, the transport ship battled November storms on the Pacific Ocean. Waves crashed against the hull, making the entire vessel creak and groan like a dying animal. Below deck, the 37 Japanese women fought seasickness, fear, and the constant dread of what awaited them. America must be in ruins, Etsuko whispered one night as the women huddled together for warmth. Our pilots bombed their cities. Their people must be starving and angry. Fumiko nodded. Everyone in Japan knew about the successful bombing raids on American soil. The newspapers had printed photos of burning American buildings, celebrating each attack. They will make us pay for their suffering, she said. At night, the women took turns keeping watch. They were certain the American guards would eventually come for them. The knives remained hidden, but ready. Harumi's son developed a fever during the journey. When she finally approached a guard to beg for medicine, she was shaking with terror. The guard called for a medic who gave the child something that reduced his temperature within hours. Why would they help him? Harumi whispered to Fumiko that night. It makes no sense. They need healthy slaves, another woman answered. Americans make prisoners work until they die. On the 11th day, the captain announced they were approaching California. The women were allowed on deck, one small group at a time, to get fresh air. When Fumiko's group emerged from the stuffy hold, she gasped at her first sight of America. The San Francisco harbor spread before them, bathed in morning sunlight. Tall buildings reached toward the sky. Cars moved along busy streets. People, normal-looking people, went about their business. Where's the destruction? Asked Sachiko, the nurse, looking confused. I don't see any bomb damage. Perhaps San Francisco wasn't bombed, suggested Fumiko, though doubt crept into her voice. As they docked, more surprises awaited. Well-dressed American civilians walked along the waterfront. Children played. No one looked starving. No one looked angry or defeated. The propaganda posters showed hungry Americans eating rats, whispered Harumi. Those children look healthy. It must be a show, Fumiko insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. For our benefit. After processing at a facility near the port, the women were loaded onto a train. They expected cattle cars with no windows, like stories they'd heard about European prisoners. Instead, they found regular passenger cars with cushioned seats and large windows. Keep your eyes open, Fumiko instructed the others. Learn everything you can about the enemy. The train journey lasted 3 days. Through the windows, America unfolded before their eyes. They saw golden hills in California, red rock formations in Arizona, endless plains in the Midwest. What they didn't see were bombed cities, starving people, military checkpoints. The countryside looked untouched by war. Maybe this isn't the real America, suggested one woman. Maybe they're taking us through special areas. But there were thousands of miles of these special areas. Farmland stretched to the horizon with tractors working the fields. Small towns appeared and disappeared, with white church steeples and red barns. Children waved at the passing train. Look at all the food they grow, Harumi said, pointing to endless cornfields. Japan told us America was starving. At stops, they saw American women in factories, loading supplies, working as ticket agents, women driving trucks, women in military uniforms. Japanese women die for honor, whispered Sachiko. American women work like men. None of it matched what they had been told all their lives. On the third day, the train entered Kansas. Flat land stretched in all directions. The sky seemed bigger here, endless blue touching the earth at the horizon. "We're here," announced the translator, a Japanese-American soldier who spoke to them with a strange accent. "Camp Sunflower." Through the train windows, they saw it appear in the distance. Wooden buildings arranged in neat rows, fences topped with barbed wire, guard towers at each corner. "It looks like the punishment camps they described," Fumiko said, her hands trembling again. The women clutched their hidden weapons as they were led from the train to waiting trucks. Still, no one searched them. No one touched them. The trucks carried them through the camp gate. American flags snapped in the December wind. Guards stood at attention but kept their distance. "When will they show their true nature?" Harumi wondered aloud, her son clinging to her neck. They were taken to a processing building with concrete floors and pale green walls. Inside, a middle-aged American woman waited with the translator. "Welcome to Camp Sunflower," she said through the translator. Her voice was firm but not unkind. "You will be housed here until arrangements can be made for your return to Japan after the war." The women exchanged glances. Return to Japan? That couldn't be right. "You will not be harmed," the woman continued. "You will receive 3 meals daily. You will have medical care. You may work if you choose, and you will be paid for your labor." As the rules were explained, the women remained silent, suspicious. This had to be a trick. The real treatment would start once they were separated, they were sure. They were assigned to barracks, simple wooden buildings with rows of beds. Each bed had a thin mattress, not luxurious, but better than the ship's hold or the caves of Saipan. "Tonight," Fumiko whispered as they entered their new quarters, "tonight they will come." The women arranged their few belongings and prepared themselves. Some placed their knives under pillows. Others kept them in their clothes. Night fell over Kansas. The women did not sleep. They sat on their beds, watching the door, listening for footsteps, waiting for the American monsters to finally reveal themselves. But all they heard was the wind whistling through the plains and the occasional sound of a guard walking past the building. The door remained closed. The night passed in silence, and in that silence the first tiny seed of doubt took root in their minds. Dawn broke over Camp Sunflower, painting the Kansas sky in shades of pink and gold. The 37 Japanese women had not slept. They sat on the edges of their beds, eyes red and burning, still watching the door. "They're waiting until we let our guard down," whispered Etsuko, clutching her hidden knife. Fumiko nodded. "Stay alert. Don't eat or drink anything they offer." A sharp knock on the door made them all jump. Hearts racing, they braced themselves for the moment they had been dreading. The door opened. A young American soldier stood there, but he didn't enter. He remained in the doorway, eyes averted as if giving them privacy. Behind him was a wooden cart. "Supplies," he said simply, then stepped aside. Another soldier wheeled the cart into the barracks, placed it just inside the door, and left without a word. The door closed. For several minutes, no one moved. "It's a trap," someone whispered. Finally, Sachiko, the nurse, approached the cart cautiously. She lifted the canvas covering. "Blankets," she said, her voice filled with disbelief. "Soap, towels." She continued pulling items out. Toothbrushes, combs, clean underwear, sanitary supplies. At the bottom of the cart, canned peaches, condensed milk, and crackers sealed in wax paper. "Poison?" suggested one woman. Sachiko opened a can of peaches and smelled it. "It seems normal." "Don't touch it," Fumiko warned. "This must be their trick. They give us things, then they come to take payment." The women agreed. They would not use these items. They would not be fooled. That first day passed in a fog of fear and confusion. A female guard came at noon to escort them to the mess hall. They followed in tight formation, children clutched to their mothers' chests, eyes downcast. The mess hall was a large building with wooden tables and benches. American soldiers served food from metal containers, some kind of meat stew, bread, and vegetables. Remembering Fumiko's warning, most women took only tiny bites or nothing at all. They watched the American guards eating the same food at a separate table. The guards talked among themselves, laughing occasionally, seemingly unaware of or uninterested in their prisoners. "Why don't they look at us?" Harumi whispered to Fumiko. In Japan, They'd been told American men considered Japanese women exotic prizes. Fumiko's eyes narrowed. They're playing a game, trying to make us feel safe. That night, they again prepared for the worst. Some pushed beds together, others took turns keeping watch, all kept their weapons close. But like the night before, only silence greeted them. No boots on the steps, no hands on the door, just the Kansas wind and distant train whistles. By morning, exhaustion had taken its toll. When breakfast was announced, hunger drove them to the mess hall. This time, the food was oatmeal, eggs, and something called coffee. Fumiko watched as an American woman server filled her bowl with steaming oatmeal. The woman smiled briefly, then moved on to the next person. No threats, no leering, just serving food. After 5 minutes of staring at her bowl, Fumiko finally took a spoonful. The oatmeal was hot and sweet with sugar, real sugar, which she hadn't tasted in years. A tear slid down her wrinkled cheek before she could stop it. Around her, other women began eating cautiously. Children ate hungrily, reaching for second helpings, which were given without question. "Why are they feeding us like this?" asked Etsuko after breakfast as they walked back to their barracks. "Our soldiers said Americans starved their prisoners." "They're fattening us up," Fumiko said firmly, her voice low so the guards wouldn't hear. "For experiment. Or worse." But some women were beginning to doubt. Harumi watched as a nurse named Betty examined her son, who still had a slight cough from his shipboard illness. The red-haired American woman's hands were gentle as she listened to the boy's chest. She gave him a spoonful of medicine and a small toy, a wooden car painted red. "Thank you," Harumi said in hesitant English, one of the few phrases she knew. Betty smiled. Just smiled. No threats, no cruelty. Just a smile between two women concerned about a child. That afternoon, more surprises came. The women were offered jobs if they wanted them. Laundry, kitchen work, garden tending, with pay. "It's not required," the translator explained, "but if you work, you will receive wages." "Slaves don't get paid," Sachiko whispered to Fumiko. "It's part of their game," Fumiko insisted, but her voice lacked conviction. By the end of the first week, small changes were visible among the group. Some women had begun using the soap, appreciating being clean after months of hardship. Others had accepted extra blankets as December brought cold winds across the plains. A few had volunteered for kitchen work, curious about American food. Each night, they still waited for the other shoe to drop, for the monsters from the propaganda posters to finally appear. But each night passed peacefully. On the seventh night, as they've prepared for bed, Harumi approached Fumiko, who sat alone writing in a small notebook. "Teacher Fumiko," she said quietly, "what if everything they told us was wrong?" Fumiko looked up sharply. "You must not think such things. They are the enemy. But they've given us food, medicine, warm beds. They don't touch us. They barely look at us." Harumi hesitated. "My son is getting healthier here than he was on Saipan during the fighting." "They want something from us," Fumiko said, but doubt had crept into her voice. "No one gives without expecting return." "What if they just want peace?" Harumi suggested. Fumiko had no answer. That night, for the first time, some of the women slept. Really slept. Not the half-awake terror of before, but actual rest. A few even placed their knives under their mattresses instead of under their pillows. A small change, but significant. Outside their barracks, snow began to fall across the Kansas plains. None of the women had ever seen snow like this. Thick, white flakes that transformed the landscape overnight. They stood at the windows in the morning, watching American guards shovel paths between buildings. "In Japan, they told us America was a land of monsters," whispered Harumi to no one in particular. "But look, it's just people. People who get cold. People who shovel snow." Hey, comment below what you think these women must have felt in those first days. Can you imagine having everything you believed turned upside down? What would you do if you suddenly discovered your enemy wasn't the monster you were told they were? 2 weeks after arriving at Camp Sunflower, the camp director called a meeting. Through the translator, she made an announcement that left the Japanese women confused. "Those who wish to work may do so. Laundry needs workers. The kitchen needs helpers. The garden will need tending in spring. Pay is 15 cents per hour." The women exchanged glances. Pay? Actual money? It is your choice, the translator added. No one is forced to work. That evening, the barracks buzzed with whispered conversations. It must be a trick, said Etsuko. They'll make us work all day, then never pay us. But some American women work in the camp, Sachiko pointed out. I've seen them in the office and the clinic. Fumiko sat silent, thinking. Finally, she spoke. I will try the laundry. If it's a trap, better me than someone younger. The next morning, Fumiko and 3 other women reported to the laundry building. A gray-haired American woman showed them how to operate the washing machines, how to fold sheets, how to press uniforms. The work was hard, but straightforward. No one shouted, no one threatened. When they made mistakes, they were simply shown again. At the end of that first week, the supervisor handed each woman an envelope. Inside, dollar bills and coins, actual money. Fumiko stared at the bills in her palm. This wasn't slavery. This was employment. That night, she placed the money in a small cloth pouch she'd made from a scrap of fabric. Her first American earnings. Her first step towards something she hadn't dared to imagine. Independence. More women signed up for jobs. Harumi joined the kitchen staff. Others worked in the camp office, filing papers. Some mended uniforms. By the 3rd week, nearly half the Japanese women were working somewhere in the camp. With their earnings, they began to buy small things from the camp store. Soap that smelled better than the basic bars they'd been given. Hairpins, fabric for sewing, candy for the children. December brought heavier snow. The women, most of whom had never experienced a Midwestern winter, huddled in their barracks. Extra blankets appeared without them asking. Warmer coats were distributed. Boots replaced their thin shoes. Why do they care if we're cold? Asked one woman. No one had an answer that made sense within their old understanding of Americans. One morning, a new person arrived at the barracks. She was a middle-aged American woman with gray hair pulled into a neat bun, wearing a simple blue dress and carrying a stack of books. This is Grace Miller, the translator said. She has volunteered to teach you English. Grace smiled at the room full of suspicious faces. Hello, she said clearly. Welcome to Kansas. 3 times a week, Grace came to teach basic English. Hello, thank you, please, water, food, help, cold, warm. Simple words to help them navigate their new environment. Fumiko, with her background as a teacher, took the lessons seriously. But the English sounds were difficult for her aging mouth. She struggled with T and R sounds. During one lesson, as she repeatedly failed to pronounce 3 correctly, Fumiko's face flushed with shame. Grace moved beside her. Try again, she said gently. Watch my mouth. Three. Fumiko tried again. Sri. Grace reached out and squeezed Fumiko's hand. It's okay. Learning is hard. The touch was brief, just fingers wrapped around fingers, warm, supportive, human. Fumiko froze. It was the first time an American had touched her intentionally. The first non-threatening contact with the enemy. Just a hand on a hand. Something broke inside her. Something hard and cold that had protected her for years. A tear slid down her cheek. Grace simply nodded and moved on to the next student, giving Fumiko privacy with her emotions. That night, Fumiko lay awake, replaying the moment in her mind. The gentle pressure of Grace's fingers, the absence of threat, the presence of something she hadn't expected, compassion. As December deepened, the camp prepared for something called Christmas. The Japanese women watched as Americans hung colorful decorations and small lights. They sang songs the prisoners didn't understand. They seemed happy, despite the war, despite the cold, despite everything. On Christmas Eve, soldiers arrived at the barracks carrying bags. The women tensed, old fears resurfacing, but inside the bags, oranges, real oranges, bright and fragrant, and small wrapped packages for each woman and child. Harumi helped her son unwrap his gift. A small wooden train, painted green. Her own package contained a handkerchief with tiny flowers embroidered on the corner and a chocolate bar. Why? She asked the translator who had come with the soldiers. Why give us gifts? It's Christmas, he said simply, as if that explained everything. That night, the barracks smelled of orange peels. Children played with their new toys. Women examined their handkerchiefs, combs, and small luxuries with bewilderment. Harumi's son fell asleep clutching his wooden train. She watched his peaceful face, round cheeks sticky from chocolate. For the first time since her husband's death, she allowed herself to imagine a future, a life after war, her son growing up, going to school, becoming a man. It terrified her more than captivity ever had. In January, a woman from the Red Cross arrived at the camp. She carried paper, envelopes, and pencils. "You may write letters to your families in Japan," she announced. "We will try to deliver them when possible." The women gathered around, disbelieving. "They'll read our letters," warned Etsuko. "They'll punish our families." But the desire to connect with loved ones was too strong. One by one, they took paper and began to write. Fumiko stared at the blank sheet for a long time. What could she possibly say? How could she explain this place, this experience, these Americans who defied everything she'd been told? Finally, she began. "Dear sister, I am alive. I am in America. I am safe." She paused, pencil hovering over paper, then added, "The Americans feed us 3 meals every day. They give us warm blankets. They pay us for work. They have not harmed us. They have not even touched us." The truth, simple and shocking. The children adjusted fastest to camp life. They learned English quickly, picking up words and phrases from Grace and the guards. They played in the snow, making round men with coal eyes and carrot noses. They began to smile again. Harumi's son called every male soldier uncle and every female worker auntie. He had forgotten his fear, forgotten the caves of Saipan, forgotten the propaganda. "He's becoming American?" Harumi whispered to Fumiko one evening, watching her son chatter in mixed Japanese and English to a guard who patiently listened. "No," Fumiko said. "He's becoming a citizen of a world different than the one we thought existed. A world where enemies can show kindness. Where people can see beyond flags and uniforms." She touched the hidden knife she still kept, though she hadn't held it in weeks. "Perhaps we all are." Hey, if this story is showing you a side of history you never knew about, smash that like button so more people can discover these untold stories. The textbooks don't tell us everything, and sometimes the most powerful moments in history are the quiet ones that happened when no one was watching. February brought slightly warmer days to Camp Sunflower. The snow began to melt, revealing patches of brown grass beneath. Inside the barracks, a different kind of thawing was taking place. "I don't understand," Sachiko said one evening as the women gathered after dinner. "Everything we were told about Americans, it was wrong." The room fell silent. This truth had been growing in their minds for weeks, but no one had dared speak it so plainly. Etsuko shook her head. "Not everything. They still keep us behind fences. We are still prisoners." "Prisoners who are paid for work," said Harumi. "Prisoners who receive medical care and letters from home." Fumiko, who had been writing in her journal, looked up. "In Japan, they told us American women were weak and useless. But here." She gestured outside, where female guards patrolled and nurses worked in the clinic. "American women drive trucks. They give injections. They teach." The translator had told them stories that seemed impossible. American women working in airplane factories, building bombs, flying transport planes. There were even female pilots called wasps who delivered fighter planes from factories to military bases. "My husband said Japanese women must be ready to die with honor," Harumi said quietly. "American women seem ready to live with purpose." This new understanding came with pain. If this was untrue, if Americans weren't monsters, what else had been lies? "Do you still have your knife?" Sachiko asked Fumiko in a whisper. Fumiko nodded. She kept it wrapped in cloth under her mattress. She hadn't touched it in weeks, but couldn't bring herself to discard it. "Why?" Sachiko pressed. "We've been here 3 months. No one has hurt us." "Because..." Fumiko started, then stopped. How could she explain? The knife wasn't just protection against Americans anymore. It was protection against a world that made no sense. Against the collapse of everything she believed. In March, news arrived that changed everything. The camp director called all the women to a meeting. "Japan is beginning to accept refugees," the translator announced. The process will take time, but you will eventually return home. A murmur ran through the group. Home. The word held both comfort and dread. When? Someone asked. The first groups might leave by late summer, came the answer. That night, the barracks buzzed with conflicting emotions. I want to see my mother, said a young woman, but what will we tell them? Etsuko finished for her. What will we say about this place? About these people? It was the question they all faced. How could they describe their experience to families who still believed American soldiers were monsters? Who would believe that their captors had shown them respect? Who would understand their confusion? If we tell the truth, Sachiko said, they will think we have been brainwashed, or that we are traitors. And if we lie? Asked Harumi. If we say we were mistreated when we weren't? Fumiko spoke slowly, choosing her words carefully. Then we become part of the lie. We help keep the hatred alive. On a sunny April morning, Fumiko was hanging laundry when she spotted Betty, the red-haired nurse, walking with a soldier. They were holding hands, laughing. The soldier said something, and Betty playfully pushed his shoulder. The simple, human moment struck Fumiko like a physical blow. These people, these Americans, loved. They laughed. They teased, just like people in Japan did before the war consumed everything. That evening, as Fumiko taught a young mother how to darn socks, she found herself saying, I used to believe Americans had claws instead of fingers. The young woman looked up, surprised by the strange statement. Fumiko continued, I believed they had fangs, that they ate children, that they collected body parts as trophies. We all believe that, the younger woman said. Yes, and now I watch them eat with forks and knives. I watch them tend gardens. I watch them fall in love. Fumiko's hands trembled. The most difficult thing isn't being a prisoner, Yuko. It's discovering your enemies are human. The most destabilizing thing wasn't hardship. The women had expected hardship. They had prepared for cruelty. What they hadn't prepared for was kindness without agenda, respect without reason, humanity without borders. Each small decency was a blow to their worldview. Each act of respect was a crack in the foundation of everything they had been raised to believe. One day, Harumi found her son playing catch with an American guard. The soldier was kneeling to be at the child's height, patiently showing him how to throw a ball. When her son succeeded, the soldier gave him a high five. That night, Harumi wept silently in her bed, not from fear or sadness, but from the overwhelming confusion of it all. What's wrong with me? She whispered to Fumiko the next day. I should hate them. They killed my husband. They destroyed our home on Saipan, but I watch them with my son and I feel gratitude. Fumiko finished for her. Harumi nodded, ashamed. The hardest wounds to heal are the ones that change how you see yourself, Fumiko said. Physical pain ends, but when your mind is forced to remake itself, to admit that what you believed was wrong, that pain transforms you forever. In May, a damaged Japanese flag was found in the camp storeroom. The director asked if the women would like to have it. They accepted it silently, this symbol of home that now carried complicated emotions. That evening, they hung the flag in their barracks. They stood before it, this red circle on white that had once meant everything to them. Some bowed deeply, honoring the homeland they still loved. But something had changed. The flag no longer represented absolute truth or unquestioned loyalty. It was just fabric marking a place they came from, a place with flaws, a place that had told them lies. We can love Japan and still see its mistakes, Fumiko said quietly to the group, just as these Americans can treat us with respect even though our countries are enemies. Is that allowed? Asked a young woman. To see both sides as people? Fumiko had no easy answer. In Japan, such thinking would be dangerous, treasonous even, but they weren't in Japan anymore, and the women they had become in Camp Sunflower were no longer the women who had hidden in caves on Saipan, clutching knives and waiting for monsters. They had expected the worst of humanity in this enemy land. What disoriented them most was finding pieces of the best of humanity instead. Not perfect, not without flaws, but recognizably, undeniably human. And that recognition had changed them in ways no amount of propaganda could ever undo. August arrived with scorching heat across the Kansas plains. The first list of names was posted. 20 Japanese women, including Fumiko and Harumi, would leave Camp Sunflower in September. The remaining 17 would follow in October. Fumiko read her name on the list with mixed feelings. 9 months ago, the thought of returning to Japan had been her only hope. Now, it filled her with uncertainty. What will we find? She asked Harumi as they sat outside the barracks, watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink. The Americans say much of Japan is destroyed. Harumi's son played nearby with a small collection of toys given to him by the guards. He spoke more English than Japanese now. At least we are alive to return, Harumi said. Many are not. In the weeks before departure, the women sorted through their belongings. They had arrived with almost nothing. Now they had clothes, small keepsakes, and money saved from their work. The camp provided each woman with a canvas bag for packing. Fumiko folded her earnings, nearly $50, into a cloth pouch and tucked it into her diary. It wasn't much by American standards, but in war-torn Japan, it might feed her family for months. 2 days before their scheduled departure, Grace came to say goodbye. The English teacher had formed special bonds with several women, especially Fumiko. She brought a small package wrapped in brown paper. For you, Grace said, handing it to Fumiko. Inside was a Bible, its black cover soft with use. Grace's name written inside the front cover. I know you may not read it, Grace said through the translator, but I wanted you to have something to remember that not everyone in this world is cruel. Fumiko ran her fingers over the book's cover. She couldn't read the English words inside, but she understood the gift's meaning. Thank you, she said in careful English. Thank you, thank you. To her surprise, Grace reached out and hugged her. Fumiko stood stiffly at first, unused to such open displays of affection. Then, slowly, she relaxed into the embrace. On their final evening at Camp Sunflower, the Americans organized a small farewell gathering. There was cake, a rare treat. The camp director gave a short speech wishing them safe travels. Betty, the nurse, brought small medical kits for each woman, bandages, aspirin, and ointment for the journey. The guard who had played catch with Harumi's son knelt down and gave the boy a baseball. Practice, he said with a smile. Maybe someday Japan and America will play baseball together instead of fighting. The boy nodded solemnly, clutching the ball like treasure. As the women boarded trucks the next morning to begin their long journey home, many found themselves looking back at the camp that had been their prison and, strangely, their sanctuary. Some cried openly, others remained stoic, but with visible emotion in their eyes. Fumiko, sitting near the truck's back, watched Camp Sunflower shrink in the distance. The American flag flapped in the morning breeze. Guards waved goodbye. It was nothing like the America she had been taught to fear. The journey home took 3 weeks. A train to California, a ship across the Pacific. The closer they got to Japan, the quieter the women became. What would they find? What would be left? When they finally saw the Japanese coastline in late September, some women rushed to the ship's rail, weeping with joy. Others, including Fumiko, approached more slowly with a growing dread. Yokohama Harbor came into view. Where there had once been a busy port city stood miles of emptiness, flattened buildings, burned out shells of warehouses, people living in makeshift shelters among the ruins. This can't be Japan, whispered a woman beside Fumiko. This can't be home. But it was. This devastation, this hunger, this defeat, this was what waited for them. They disembarked into chaos. American occupation forces directed traffic and distributed food to long lines of thin, ragged people. Children with hollow eyes begged for candy. Old men sat staring at nothing. Fumiko made her way to Kyoto slowly. Trains ran irregularly. Roads were damaged. She walked when necessary, her canvas bag heavy on her shoulder. It took her 8 days to reach her mother's house. The neighborhood had been spared the worst bombing, but signs of hardship were everywhere. Gardens had been dug in every available space to grow food. Windows were patched with paper. People wore clothes mended many times over. When Fumiko finally walked up the path to her family home, her mother ran out to meet her. At 70, Fumiko's mother had become frail, her back bent, her face deeply lined, but her eyes lit up at the sight of her daughter. "Fumiko, my daughter!" she cried, embracing her. "The gods have brought you back to me." That night, over a small meal of rice and pickled vegetables, a feast by current Japanese standards, her mother asked the question Fumiko had been dreading. Was it terrible? Did they hurt you? Fumiko looked into her mother's eyes, seeing the hatred and fear of Americans that propaganda had planted there. How could she explain? Where would she even begin? No, Fumiko said finally. They did not hurt me, mother. They did not even touch me. Her mother's eyes widened in disbelief. But everyone knows Americans torture their prisoners. The radio said. The radio lied. Fumiko interrupted gently. The posters lied. The newspapers lied. Everything we were told about Americans was wrong. She told her mother about Camp Sunflower, about the food 3 times a day, about working for wages, about Grace teaching English and Betty caring for the children, about guards who knocked before entering their barracks, about dignity preserved when it could have been taken away. Her mother listened in stunned silence. When Fumiko finished, the old woman stared at her hands for a long time. If this is true, she said finally, then what else was untrue? What else did they tell us that was lies? Many things, I think, Fumiko said. She reached into her bag and pulled out Grace's Bible. This was a gift from my American teacher. She didn't try to convert me. She just wanted me to remember that kindness exists even between enemies. Her mother touched the book cautiously as if it might burn her fingers. The hardest part, Fumiko said, wasn't being a prisoner, mother. It was discovering that our enemies were human beings, just like us. Kyoto, Japan, spring 1965. The cherry blossoms fell like pink snow outside the window as Fumiko, now 76, carefully opened a drawer in her small writing desk. Her daughter Midori, 35 and visiting from Tokyo, watched as her mother removed a worn black book. You've asked many times about the war, Fumiko said, running her fingers over the Bible's cracked leather cover. About my time in America, today I will tell you everything. 20 years had passed since Fumiko returned from Camp Sunflower. Japan had rebuilt. The American occupation had ended. Former enemies had become allies. Young Japanese people wore American fashion, listened to American music, played baseball. The world had moved forward, but some things remained. This book, these memories, this story she had told only in pieces before. This Bible was a gift from an American woman named Grace, Fumiko explained, opening it to show her daughter the handwritten name inside. I never learned to read the English words, but I kept it all these years. Why? Midori asked. You're not Christian. I kept it because it reminds me of the most important lesson of my life, Fumiko said, that people are not their governments, that humanity can exist even in war. Fumiko told her daughter everything, the propaganda about American monsters, the suicide pacts on Saipan, the hidden knives on the ship crossing the Pacific. She described the terror of those first days in Kansas, waiting for cruelty that never came, the shock of being treated with dignity by the enemy. The hardest part wasn't the cold or the work or being away from home, Fumiko said. The hardest part was realizing that everything I believed was wrong, that the people I was taught to hate were just people. Midori listened silently, occasionally wiping tears. This was so different from the war stories she had heard from others. Tales of brutality, suffering, and hatred. What happened to the others? She asked. The women who were with you? Fumiko smiled sadly. We tried to stay in touch, but it was difficult in those early years after the war. Harumi and her son moved to Osaka. The boy grew up to become an English teacher. Can you imagine? Sachiko, the nurse, worked with American doctors during the occupation. Etsuko never really adjusted back to Japan. She was too angry, not at the Americans, but at being lied to by her own country. Over the years, Fumiko had met occasionally with some of the Camp Sunflower women. They shared a bond that no one else could understand. They had crossed a bridge between hatred and understanding that most never had the opportunity to cross. Some people called us traitors, Fumiko said. They said we had been brainwashed. They couldn't accept that Americans had treated us humanely. Were you afraid to tell the truth? Midori asked. At first, yes, but as Japan changed, as relations with America improved, it became easier. Some of us even spoke to newspapers in the 1950s. A few women corresponded with the Americans they had met. Grace wrote to me twice before she died in 1958. Fumiko carefully turned the Bible's pages to reveal a pressed flower, a prairie wildflower from Kansas that Grace had given her. I often wonder what would have happened if they had treated us cruelly, as we expected. Fumiko said, "What seeds of hatred would have been planted? How would those seeds have grown in the next generation? In you?" She looked directly at her daughter. "Instead, they chose differently. They chose to see us as human beings, not enemies. And that choice changed everything. It changed me. It changed how I raised you." Midori nodded slowly. Her mother had never spoken badly of Americans, even when others did. She had taught Midori to judge people by their actions, not their nationality or the stories told about them. "The most powerful weapon in that war wasn't the atomic bomb," Fumiko continued. "It was the choice some people made to remain human when everything around them encouraged them to become monsters. The guards who could have hurt us but didn't. The nurses who could have neglected us but didn't. The teachers who could have ignored us but didn't." She closed the Bible and placed it in her daughter's hands. "I want you to have this now, not because of the religion inside it, but because of what it represents. A moment when someone saw past flags and uniforms and propaganda and simply reached out one human hand to another." Midori took the book carefully. "I'll treasure it, Mother." "And tell the story," Fumiko added. "When I am gone, tell this story. Not just the part about American kindness, but the part about Japanese lies. Both sides matter. Both truths need to be remembered." Fumiko rose slowly, her arthritic knees protesting, and walked to the window. Outside, Japan had transformed. Modern buildings rose where bomb craters once stood. Young people rushed by without memories of hunger or fear. "You know," she said, "I kept that knife for years after I returned. The one I planned to use on myself if Americans turned out to be the monsters I expected. I couldn't let it go, even though I no longer believed I would need it." "What happened to it?" Midori asked. Fumiko smiled. "In 1952, when the American occupation officially ended, I buried it in the garden. A proper funeral for an old fear. I planted a cherry tree above it." She pointed out the window to the blooming tree in their small yard. "Every spring when it blooms, I think about how beauty can grow from buried fears, how life continues after war, how hatred, when not fed, eventually dies." In the years that followed, Midori did tell her mother's story, first to her own children, then to schools, and eventually to historians documenting civilian experiences during World War II. The story of 37 women who expected the worst of humanity but found something else entirely, a capacity for decency that transcended national boundaries. The Bible remained in the family, passing from generation to generation, not as a religious text, but as evidence that even in mankind's darkest hour, light can still shine through the most unexpected cracks. And somewhere in Kansas, the children and grandchildren of guards, nurses, and teachers from Camp Sunflower carried their own stories. Stories about Japanese women who arrived, terrified, and left as friends. Stories about how their own relatives had chosen to remain human when the world was tearing itself apart. Small acts of dignity, small choices of restraint, small moments of seeing the humanity in supposed enemies. These things prevented seeds of hatred from taking root and growing into the next generation's wars. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe for more Untold Dubuhui stories that show our shared humanity even in mankind's darkest hour. History isn't just about battles and borders, it's about those moments when people chose to be better than their circumstances demanded. Those are the stories worth remembering. Today, nearly 80 years after these Japanese women expected the worst but received unexpected kindness, their story still has the power to change how we see the world. In a time when it's easier than ever to view others as enemies, people from different countries with different beliefs, or who look different than us, this forgotten chapter of history asks us an important question. What if the monsters we fear are actually just people like us? Think about how many conflicts start and continue because we stop seeing others as human. We believe stories about them, without questioning if those stories are true. We forget that behind every flag, every uniform, every label, there's a person with hopes, fears, and a family who loves them. These Japanese women arrived in America clutching hidden knives, ready to die rather than face the monsters they had been told Americans were. They left knowing something profound, that humanity exists even in those we're taught to hate. The guards at Camp Sunflower could have been cruel. The rules of war might have even allowed it. No one would have known or punished them if they had mistreated their prisoners. But they chose restraint. They chose to see women and children not enemies. They chose to respect boundaries that war so often erases. And in doing so, they showed a kind of strength more powerful than any weapon. As Fumiko said years later, the most shocking thing wasn't what the Americans did to us, it was what they didn't do. Those guards never touched the Japanese women, never violated their dignity, never confirmed the hatred they had been taught to expect. That choice, to remain human when everything around you encourages monstrosity, is perhaps the greatest courage of all. So the next time you hear someone described as an enemy, as something less than human, remember these 37 women and their hidden knives. Remember how their story of expected hatred transformed into unexpected understanding. Because sometimes the most powerful story isn't about what happens in war, it's about what doesn't happen, and how that restraint can change everything.